Okay, welcome, and thanks to John. My name is Mark Warrilow, Head of Skills Development here at Connected Places Catapult. Thank you very much for joining the session on shaping the future of digital twin skills. That last session has certainly given us a lot to think about. I also co-chair the Cross Catapult workshop, the Workforce and Skills Group, which is funded by Innovate UK. And a recurring theme is how to identify future skills requirements. I think this afternoon is a unique opportunity to gather an evidence base, to validate the skills initiatives required for digital twins, and to identify gaps in knowledge and understanding which may hold back the development of digital twins. We're going to use Slido to gather your thoughts throughout the session, and I encourage you all here in person and also online to contribute. So the first question relates to whether there is a skills gap, which I'm sure you know this, but it's a shortfall in skills in the current workforce. In other words, a requirement to upskill your existing workforce. And that's as opposed to a skills shortage, which is really around supply and demand in the workforce. So please go onto Slido and use the codes on the screen.
Can we see how many people are on Slido?
How many people in this room are on Slido? Great.
Okay, that's good.
Well, thanks to everyone that raised their hand. Those that aren't, please do get out on mobile. Use the codes that are on the screen. And this is the first question. We'll give it a few moments and then we'll get into having a look at results. Do you think there is a digital twin skills gap in your organisation? In other words, a requirement to upskill your existing workforce? Okay. We'll go and see the results coming in. Shifting around, but I think a fairly resounding yes, with almost 4/5 of respondents saying yes. Quite a few not sures as well. So I think, well, good. It's always a bit of a risk asking this question at the start of a session like this, but thank you. So there is a digital twin skills gap. And we'll have a look at another question very briefly, and then we'll introduce our panel. What's the main knowledge requirement, do you think, for senior leaders in digital twins? So think about your organisation, think about organisations you work with or work for. What's the main knowledge requirement for senior leaders in digital twins? So this will appear as a word cloud. So if you're writing a whole sentence, it might be slightly tricky, but hopefully short answers will gather some good response. After today, we'll be consolidating these to really analyse what you're saying.
Can we get it on this one as well?
So benefits. Benefits, I suppose, could be interpreted lots of different ways. Benefits for the organisation, benefits for society at large, benefits for the industry. Data literacy and value coming out very strongly. Okay, well, please do continue to put those in. Certainly give our panel food for thought. With that, I'll hand over to Justin Anderson, Director of the Digital Twin Hub. Justin.
Thank you, Mark. That all worked rather well. I was expecting we might have a hiccup, but we've got it all there. Can we keep that on the screen? Because we will be using it again, actually, in a minute. So we've heard a lot about skills today. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And we at the Digital Twin Hub have been having a number of conversations with different trading and educational providers. I think I'll stand just for this bit. To try and understand what it is we can actually do. We heard earlier from Matt saying he feels that pressure, but clearly by working with others in an alliance of some sort, to be able to upskill in a similar way across similar types of organizations with similar problems, it just makes sense to do that. He also said that the speed of change is so huge. We've got this dynamic requirement that he might have people trained up this week, but next week something else comes along and he's got to work out how to do that. So we've got some real challenges at the core of our education and training business models as well that we have to address. So we've been looking at how we might put something together to address this, and we want to work with you today to test some of our ideas. That's why we're starting to sort of bring in some extra use of Slido today. We want it to be really interactive. We want you to help us shape some of our thinking here, so that as we go forward, we've actually got some great programs that we can build on top of the work that we've got already. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and maybe as they do, also just reference what we've just seen, because that was the first time any of us saw it. And let's bring that into our thinking so we can start to recognize what people are saying about the needs and what's required. This is senior leadership in digital twins. This is what they need. And 80% of them need that, apparently. I'm also interested to know more about the 10% that don't think we've got a problem. I think that's just as interesting to understand. I am delighted to introduce Melissa. Melissa, go ahead.
Is this working?
Thank you.
Oh, are you sure it's working? Is this working? Can you hear me at the back? It's fine. Yes, now I can hear it. Okay. So I'm Melissa Zanocco. I'm head of programs for the infrastructure client group, and that is made up of 18 of the leading economic infrastructure clients in the UK. So it's water, transport, energy, nuclear and broadband, and Matt Edwards there is a proud member, and because we have a digital transformation task group, and we bring together the chief data officers or equivalent from across those 18 members. And a lesser known fact is that the Digital Twin Hub came about because of a workshop held by the DCTG, and we also like to think that Credo came about through the relationships and the trust that was built in that group. And therefore it might not be a surprise to learn that I'm also co-chair of the Digital Twin Hub Community Council. And then on to this, I don't think I was surprised by the results, but the statistic that Matt showed in the session just before, so those that were in that, was from the ICG Digital Benchmarking Survey, and it was saying that 54% don't know what their skills gap is. So there's one is knowing that you've got a skills gap, but then it's also understanding what that is. So people aren't actually looking within their organisation. They haven't got any form of survey or way of knowing what the actual skills gap is. But they're aware, as you can see there, people know there is one, but they don't know what it is. And on this, my view probably on this is that you get different answers depending on who you ask in this. So I think if you ask digital people, they'll say that the leadership needs upskilling in digital stuff. But I think that what we talk about in the digital transformation task group, and I think what you were talking about with storytelling and that kind of thing, is that maybe digital people need to learn to speak business talk and speak board language. So it's kind of a meeting in the middle of finding that the board level people have the right enough information to make the decisions that they need. That doesn't necessarily mean they need completely upskilling and all of the digital detail.
John.
So I'm John Erkoyuncu. Hello, everyone. I'm a professor in digital engineering, and I'm head of a centre called Digital Engineering and Manufacturing at Cranfield University. So my sort of experience over the past 2-3 years has been around skills development in terms of what kind of skills do we need. And in that perspective, I was leading a new master's course that's called Digital and Technology Solutions, where we talked to about 25 to 30 companies and tried to understand what are the requirements. And I think the level that we focused on was probably mid-managers. But in that sort of perspective, we were able to understand what are the requirements across different levels. So I think what's really interesting is these different levels are actually linked to each other. And we mustn't really separate these. And that's really coming out for me. And I think this is also proving it in that the senior leaders are driving the organizations. They're sort of setting the direction, telling where the real value creation is needed. But then when they look inwards, they have to influence also what sort of skills are needed across different levels. And I think when the requirements aren't flowing down properly, then we have skills issues. And I think that's also a key thing for me here in terms of knowing where value is created, knowing what kind of benefits are needed is key because that sets the requirements across the organization. And I think today's discussion is really about how do we structure skills development in a way that it's holistic and it's really looking at sectors, organizations holistically rather than just training a few groups of individuals in organizations.
Thanks, John. Stuart.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I'm Stuart Coleman. I'm Director of Business Development and Learning at the Open Data Institute, and we've been delighted to work with the Connected Places Catapult. And the question earlier was, where do I find out about the learning? Well, we've co-created some learning with them, which is really an entry point to data literacy, which I see popped up quite large on the Wordle. So if you go to learning.digitaltwinhub.co.uk, you can see that content. Just kind of 30 seconds on the ODI. We were co-founded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt in 2012. We are a not-for-profit, and our purpose is to make data work better for everyone. We do the sorts of things you would expect of an institute: research, policy, those kind of things. But learning is at the core of what we do, and we work across helping organisations reimagine the culture that data needs to kind of embody in the way they work. We have a quite firm view of what data literacy is and is not. You know, we see it as the ability for individuals and organisations to think and work critically with data and understand the role it plays in their organisation and in society as a whole. Perhaps in the same way that we in the UK consider how you might learn English language and literature at school, we see it as the same with data. It's not about having hundreds, thousands more data scientists. It's about having people across, up and down, and side to side in an organisation who have some common language. And the word in previous sessions of personas was kind of quite interesting to listen into. We've tried to develop an organisational data literacy framework. We actually call it our skills framework, and the learning that we developed with the Connected Places Catapult was aligned to that, but also was mindful of things like the Gemini principles that I understand this sector is kind of adopted when it's thinking of digital twins.
Great, thank you. Can I just turn this into a slide? Another one? Another one? And another one. Should have some little bubbles on it. It's just going to help me explain what we've been working on. Two little bubbles with a thing in between them. Try it. Okay, we haven't got the bubbles. If there are any bubbles, that would be useful. It doesn't matter. I can ask you to imagine some bubbles. So in one bubble, we have the Digital Twin Hub, which is comprised of, on one side, the community itself at large, 4,000 members. We have the working groups that this afternoon's session is delving into, and you can see the great work that they're doing. Then we have the operational team that is tasked with being able to chronicle the information, bring it together, package it up, and make sure that it's available for our members. On the other side, we have training and education providers. I have a couple here today, who are hearing the challenges for what is required. But they have their own difficulties with being able to move at the speed that the market needs. So we have created, in the first place, an agreement to create an alliance with two organizations that we're looking to expand out in order to be able to determine how we can take the great work that the DT Hub is doing and its working groups are doing to be able to connect tighter through new processes that connect directly into those training and education providers, on the basis that if we're successful, we can create a much more dynamic environment to take the information that we're at the cutting edge of seeing and receiving, whether that's case studies or the latest demonstrations or stories that people are telling, and make sure we can feed that in, and at the same time understand the needs of our community across the different providers and collectively determine what do we actually need to ensure that those professional organizations that know how to deliver courses and deliver certifications at the end of it can deliver exactly what the market needs and can move at the speed that the market needs them to move. That's a big challenge. That's what we're going to discuss this afternoon. So I'm going to ask Melissa, first of all, who is essentially representing the whole industry and the whole community and all of the needs that they have. So no pressure, Melissa. But Melissa, maybe you could also just tie us back into the last session. Not everybody was in that one, so just to sort of summarize what you heard from the working groups in terms of what we need to do from a skills perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm not just doing this because Matt sits on the D2TG, and we've got others from the D2TG here. But I think to summarise Matt's key points and jump in, Matt, I think number one was looking at, like, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's a lot of stuff out there, and particularly from the Centre for Digital Built Britain. So if you know, all of that information is on the Digital Twin Hub. There's still pages from the CDBB. So it's building on that. But as everyone's been saying, and as Matt said, it's moving dynamically forward, so we need to keep adding to it. The second was about storytelling and the power of storytelling, and so it's just as important as the digital skills. It is being able to sort of win hearts and minds and put things in a language that others can understand. And the third one, and this is my interpretation of what Matt said, the third one is kind of getting rid of this siloed approach, which is that we all know that we've got a skills gap within our own organisation and we're all trying to fill it. And wouldn't it be great if we could do it across, A, because it saves time and money, but also because we're working, you know, with the supplier ecosystems and they all overlap. And so if we're all doing it separately, then you're running into problems there. Anything I missed, Matt? Or?
About,
I think we'll split it now.
Yeah. So did everyone hear? He said other trades have identifiable sort of places that they can rally around. Yeah, yeah, things like that. Yeah.
We don't necessarily have that yet.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm just going to tee up the next slider question as well in the background here. But as I do that, perhaps some people could just get ready for slider. Mark, are you ready to launch that one?
Yep, ready to look at this. So
the next question to be able to provide us with some insights here, which is coming up somewhere.
Okay, let's see
on
on
your
the screen.
slider.
Okay, so question, similar to last time, but remember, slightly different take on it. What's the main knowledge requirement for graduates and mid-level managers in digital twins? Again, think about your own organisation, not necessarily answering on your behalf, but on those in your teams, the wider organisations you've worked with. Again, it will be in a word cloud, so short answers, single words tend to work best. Thanks.
Great. Well, while you're doing that, I'm going to just turn across to John and ask John, you know, from what you've heard, this is a big challenge. Cranfield isn't structured to be quite as agile and dynamic as I understand. What could be done to be able to ensure that you can really deliver what the market wants? And what are the challenges you're going to have to overcome to be able to launch a new course in October that will actually deliver in a way that is going to keep up with the requirements that people have?
So I guess this question isn't necessarily just for Cranfield, it's wider in terms of how are we dynamic and coping with the environment, with the technology that's emerging, with the types of use cases that are emerging, and also the way people are actually moving around. This is also quite interesting in the way the jobs market is much more dynamic than it was in the past. You know, if we looked back in the past, maybe an individual would stay in the same type of role 10, 20, 30 years. Today, that sort of time frame is getting shorter and shorter. So there's a big challenge in terms of how do we create content and share content in a flexible manner. So we're not talking necessarily about an individual coming into a class, sitting, listening. We have to be quite flexible in the way we deliver training. We have to be flexible in terms of how people engage with each other, how they interact with each other, how they share experiences. And I think all these kind of things are part of the learning experience. So we need to really consider the traditional ways of learning are not necessarily suitable to this context anymore. So I think we need to learn and listen a lot more to be able to be dynamic. And we need to be also flexible in terms of understanding where we create value. I think this is, for me, the big thing. We need to be able to adapt to the way value is created.
I'm going to see whether or not there's any response from the audience on this through, well, actually I'm jumping, we've got a lot of moving parts here, so, but I think I'd like to build on this, because this is fundamental to anything we want to put into place, and it's a big challenge. Can we do that? Can we make these changes that are so critical and core?
I think the key thing here is to work together. This isn't going to be a single organization doing this alone. We need to think about who can actually contribute to this, and how do we actually build these bridges so that the different communities are talking to each other and we're creating content that really matters. I think this is a key thing, and with that I mean across different levels. We need content for senior leaders, we need content for mid-managers, for graduates. So we need to really break it down in terms of how can we change maybe behaviors, how can we improve our understanding at every level, and how do we make this more accessible? I think that's also really important. Like the online training material, I find really powerful, really critical. But how do we expand this so that there's something for everyone?
Well, that's a great segue into Stuart. Stuart, we've just launched with you some free e-learning training modules on the DT Hub. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've got there and how that's going to help?
Yeah, I mean, I made a point of refreshing myself today and having a look. I think what we've done is we've tried to the point John's made, tried to work with the community to figure out what people needed, what the questions were about. The first area really is maximising data use and reuse. And licensing. Like, there seems to be quite a lot of legal concerns about how can I and can I not use data. And you know, that goes into, what about third-party data? If I'm getting data from different places, what rights do I have to use that? What licenses do I need to look out for? What things do I need to be aware of? Some good old infrastructure stuff is next. You know, how does the data need to be interoperable? What does it mean? What are the standards out there? And then really there's kind of two sections that dovetail each other around responsible use of the data, so data ethics, and a particular focus on personal data. Now, in the ODI's overall skills framework, which I described earlier, we kind of loosely describe it as a data literacy framework, we've got quite certain areas where we have particular focus, and responsible ethical use of data is one. We ourselves have public programs around that kind of thing, which I myself have been through some of them. Our own venerable Dr. Dave, I think, is delivering a session later today, so people can ask him as the subject matter expert. Put him on the spot, I can see him at the back of the room. They can ask him how we came to these conclusions. But I mean, we want the feedback, right? To the point just made a second ago. We've had a best estimate at what people need and want, and the more interaction and engagement we can get with that content, the better. I mean, we've seen much more adoption of digital learning over the last decade. I think the pandemic accelerated that in a good way, actually. So hopefully we can build on that interest. But those are the areas that we're currently focused on.
Melissa, with the client hat on, from what you've heard, does that sound as if we're starting to address some of the areas that you think need to be addressed, and to take into account what people are also saying need to be addressed?
Yes, what I like from everything that I've heard, but also from, I've had a quick glance through them as well, is the holistic approach and the, ironically, not being digital led. So even though we're talking about digital twins and digital upskilling and skills, because what I think that's, the key thing that I think that can unlock a lot of this is that we need to get everybody focused on outcomes, start, and the second thing is that we need everybody to be starting to take a system approach and seeing things through sort of system thinking. And why, maybe why am I saying that when we're talking about digital twins, etc. But I think that, as I was saying, what I like about the way you've done the modules is to give a kind of holistic approach, because what we're trying to say to everybody and make people see is that the built environment is an interconnected system of systems. And so first of all, it's trying to get people to see that. So that goes back to the storytelling, and that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with digital. That's just getting that message through that it's a complex, interconnected system of systems with social and economic infrastructure, with nature, with cyber-physical infrastructure. They're all interconnected. When you start to get that, you suddenly start to get that, oh, that's really complicated, that's really complex, oh, I don't know how to manage that. So then you start to say, and this for me is particularly at a leadership level, because I think that unlocks the silos further below, but then you start to say, okay, so how do I need to operate? So what skills and capabilities do I need to operate within a system of systems? And then we sort of start talking about saying, well, it's actually the services that come from the system, and those services are to provide better outcomes for people and nature. And that's also kind of the solution, because we're talking about the silos, but if you're all focused on achieving an outcome, and you're all incentivized around achieving that outcome together, that's how you get across the silos. So if you've got that kind of systems view, you've got that outcomes view, then you've got the sort of underpinning that, well, how are we going to do this? How do we enable all of that? And then you say, well, connected digital twins is probably, I'm going to say, in my opinion, the only way. So things like global systemic challenges like climate change, biodiversity loss, etc. The only way we're going to do that is through connected digital twins. So I think that whole mindset, then if the leaders need to say, oh, I need boundary spanning leadership, that then they're going to look through their organisation. One of you was talking about cascading it down through. That's going to unlock that then, because they're going to say, well, what skills does everybody need then if we're going to see the world in that way? So I think this kind of approach of a not digitally led approach, but a kind of outcomes and systems led approach, which then identifies the capabilities and helps us to break the silos.
Got a question come in here that's been voted up, which is, how do you incentivize people to complete the training? It's all very well, we've got it. Does this point around us having a professional body as the skills training is something people can evidence on their CVs? So what do we get after we've done the training, John? Stuart?
I think it varies, really. There's different levels of qualification that's possible. So things like postgraduate certificate, postgraduate diploma, or a master's level qualification, these are all things that you could actually really show to people and demonstrate skills. So that's the kind of approach we're currently taking, but it'll be good to progress this even beyond.
Yeah, I mean, there was, so obviously we've got traditional mechanisms like, I don't know, recognition through higher education credits. I mean, there is an increasing kind of genre of platforms out there that offer all sorts of credit-bearing incentives. But our view at the ODI is that there does need to be professionalisation, if you like, of data generally. There are bodies that are doing this quite well in certain areas. There's a body internationally operating called DARMA that's kind of data managers. There's something called EDM Council in the US, which has been set up by a bunch of chief data officers. There's no one really working, and this is an area we're trying to kind of galvanise the intersection of how do we ensure responsible ethical use of data. We ourselves at the ODI have actually developed a formal certificate path around data ethics with an assessment and peer learning and a renewal process, so that professionals who go through that, it's a 60-hour short course, it's designed in line with micro-credentials that could in time potentially form part of a higher education offering. We're not there yet. We'd probably need another 7/10 of content to get to kind of to have some credits towards something like a master's. We collaborate closely with universities, University of Oxford, Southampton, King's, through our academic network. We'd love to work with Cranfield more. I think, yeah, I mean, the space just needs to be professionalised. I guess in the context here, people are talking about digital twins. There's particular domain knowledge that's needed for that sector. I think it's a great opportunity, actually, for UK organisations. I mean, we have some great professional bodies in other sectors. I was at the Institute of Chartered Accountants yesterday. There's obviously multiple engineering institutes. I think there's 2 or 3 in the UK. So, you know, it's an opportunity we should be grabbing.
Top question coming through at the moment is, would it help to get other universities involved and work together with Cranfield? How does that work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is about collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't a single organization that can deliver everything. I think it's really an invitation to collaborate and invite collaborations, really, to sort of spread across.
And from ODI's perspective, you've already said you'd like to be working with others as well. And how does it work in other cases where you are working with universities?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we regularly welcome academics from universities through some of our learning on the basis that our academic team gets a lot of valuable input from them, and sometimes that's pushback or suggestions that feed back into the cycle. We have a growing fellowship community with our research tracks. So I forget how many active relationships, I think there's about between 12 and 15 at the moment, with universities all over the world, actually, not just in the UK, working with Duke University in the US as one example at the moment. So, I mean, we are an institute that was originally founded with support from the University of Southampton, but we've broadened that engagement. I mean, we don't have all the answers. The data space is very young, and we would much rather bring people together to help us answer the hard questions.
I'm going to jump from that to a question, a quick-fire question to everybody. As we're looking to the future, and we're considering the use of large language models, which are rippling their way across education right now, what emerging needs do we need to be aware of in the digital twin field? And what are some of the actions that we should be prepared to take at this stage? Large language models are coming towards you fast. What are we going to do about it? And what does it mean for the future of education in our space as well? Melissa.
Shall I start? Okay. So I think that what's the key thing, and in terms of what we need to make sure we're teaching, is ethics. That's going to be the key thing for me. I think that's underpinning everything. So I think that large language models, things like ChatGPT, is only one part of AI. So I think there's a whole load of stuff coming our way. And I think that we've got the Gemini principles, but it's going to need, we've talked about institutions, so I've heard it actually compared to nuclear weapons, and people saying that at one point in the world there were about 5 people who could have ended the world, and so they created the UN to stop that. And it feels like right now there are 5 people in the world who are sort of releasing things onto us that they don't actually know what they'll do, and people are saying, do we need something like a UN for that? So you were talking about institutions, Matt, but something maybe even bigger than that. So I think that it's going to be really, really, really important with all of this, that not just the skill, the upskilling and the knowledge in the digital, but that what sits alongside that is the ethics, and that these things are used to do the right thing.
John.
I'll sort of follow that up. I think for me, things like interoperability are going to be critical, in the sense of how do we now consider the system of system perspective, and how do we now connect software to software, data to data, data to models, all these things which we haven't necessarily thought of before. And how do we break these silos? I think for me that's a critical next step.
It's a great question. Obviously, there's so much interest in this space at the moment. I think we see a great opportunity, actually, in tackling data literacy in the way that some of these developments are going. I mean, a couple of examples, kind of off the cuff. So if you are trying to find and interrogate data, might be publicly openly available data, perhaps from a government source, or even from businesses. I mean, some businesses, for example, the UK banking sector is compelled to share data through open banking. To query and interrogate these data sets can be quite laborious traditionally. You have to kind of find them, download them, and through the use, but alternatively through the appropriate prompting of a large language model, whether that's Bard or ChatGPT or even some of the kind of the other systems that exist for image generation, you can actually return outputs much more quickly than you could previously. So it lowers the barrier to making data useful to people. That's a great opportunity. Of course, there's lots of risks around this. I mean, we just had a query in today from a senior government relationship saying we kind of really need to brief some of the senior civil servants on what the risks and opportunities are here. I mean, so there's kind of supply and demand. I mean, obviously, be very careful about what data you're putting into these tools, because you don't know how that's going to be used, you don't know where it's going. There's not lots of transparency into the data sets within the large language models themselves. Some research is emerging. I mean, an interesting factoid I thought the other day that my research director pointed me towards was that there is disproportionate value from some publicly free available data sets. So something like Wikipedia accounts for a very small proportion, circa 3%, of something like C4, which is the training data set that sits within ChatGPT. But actually, when you look at the epochs of value, which is effectively the amount that data is used, it is disproportionately higher than other data sources. So it is much more valuable than the common crawl data, which is all the data scraped from the web, for example. And of course, it's fairly reliable. Like, obviously, we all know Wikipedia is not 100% accurate, but it's a lot better than lots of the vitriol that's scraped from the web, right? So there's great opportunities. And we ourselves at the ODI, and Dave's pioneering this, are trying to see how we can use these tools to support learners themselves. So a great example is if you take traditional learning interventions, if you're trying to assess that someone knows something, they kind of get one shot at it. They maybe submit an assignment, and perhaps in the context of learning something about data, maybe they're being asked to work with data and then submit off an assignment to show what they've done, and it's kind of like they get one shot. With generative tools, you can actually allow an assistive experience where you use the generative tool to actually give them a preliminary mark. It can process the request, and that is game-changing. I mean, you can give a personalized learning experience to people at scale, and you can save your human intervention for when it really matters and give a level of feedback to learners that didn't exist. And the final thing, which I think will take a bit longer to pull through, is if you take what I'd call actual coal-face practices with data, like how do we generate. We've been doing a data modernization program with a global bank recently. They've got a massive challenge around the quality of their data. How do they actually improve the way it's shared, published, and consumed? You can use these tools to actually help you do some of that work. Now, few organizations have actually allowed for the use of these tools at the moment because they're not clear on where the data is going when they're making submissions. That's the biggest barrier at the moment. I think there was a famous case in the last few weeks with Samsung banging it. Obviously, Italy have banned use of these tools, but it's early days, right? I mean, there's some good opportunities there.
There's some opportunities ahead. Yeah. We should look forward and see the potential for greater education. And
exactly.
Not be too fearful. We've got lots of questions coming in here. The top one here, which I think is worth pulling out, is what's the difference between digital twin skills or just general digital skills? John.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a key question. I think with digital twin, we're talking about the flow of information, but also building two-way communications between the physical and the digital assets. So what's interesting is maybe these are the skills that we had before, like IoT, AI, these kind of things are not necessarily new, but the question is how do we bring all these things together in a way that makes it continuous? I think that's, for me, the key thing.
I might say it's a bit like that question from the session before where they asked whether it was a shadow or digital twin, and then we sort of said, who cares, really? I'm afraid I'm a bit like that on this question. I think that digital twins that are underpinned by so many things, and it's understanding that, and that's the journey that the DCTG's been on, actually, was that, sitting underneath digital twins is quality data and interoperability, etc. Things like common data environments, things like digital operating models, and actually if all those foundations are not in place, then you can't have digital twin. And going back to the board talk where we started about what do leaders need to know, leaders want a shiny digital twin that's really cool, and you say, okay, then therefore you need to improve your quality data. And they're like, well, that sounds a bit boring. Like I'm not investing in that. That's So I think that it's kind of it's all of them. We need you don't necessarily need to worry about whether it's digital twin or whether it's digital. It's these things come together, and we need all of them to move at the same pace.
So just quick fire questions from now. We've got last couple of minutes. Should the narrative be about competency as opposed to skills, i.e. including knowledge, experience and behaviours? Maybe it's not so quick?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't feel qualified enough about the digital twin space to know whether there are generally accepted competency frameworks. I mean, when it comes to data literacy, we find that organisations' competency frameworks in the area of data vary. I think there are some principles. I mean, the point Melissa was making about data quality, data is the feedstock of AI, and it might be boring for leaders, but they do need to invest in data as if it was infrastructure. And if you haven't got quality data going in, you're making, you're exposing your organisation to significant risk. But I think, yeah, it depends what your competency frameworks are.
My short answer would definitely be yes.
That's a yes. Okay,
That
that's a
would
nice
be,
short one. Thank you.
because of what we've been saying about the speed, the need. So it's not just about skills like you get. It's about holistic learning.
Another question, because we did have earlier one of the big jump out points that we think we need to be able to upskill middle managers and graduates is systems thinking. Here the question is, do concepts like system thinking actually make us try to boil the ocean rather than demonstrating value in simpler, more effective local use cases? And will terms like system thinking resonate with typical personas we need to convince? Is it overkill? Is it?
I feel like I'll take that because I feel like I need to defend my position there. I think it's the other way around. I think that if you're not taking a systems thinking approach, then you're not going to get the outcome that you were looking for. So when you're saying community approach, like that is a systems approach, so actually you could just replace community with system or the other way around. So I always use the example of a hospital. You don't need a hospital, you need health care. The healthcare is for the community. Could you get that outcome of healthcare for a community in some other way by working cross community? So without building a hospital, just optimising what's there, that saves carbon. That kind of thinking, that is community-led, that's place-based decision-making, whatever you want to call it. So I think it might be that you're trying to define systems thinking as something complex out there. It's not. I think that's what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. There are more questions. I'm afraid I'm not going to have time to get around to everybody's. That seems to have flown by from here. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you found it insightful. Certainly in terms of the next steps from here, we've got some clear next steps. If you're interested in getting involved with this alliance, understanding what we're trying to do, please go to the DT Hub website. There should be a link from the homepage there, and just register your interest, and we'll get back in touch with you on it. Thanks very much.